Hi, this is Brian, and I want to talk with you about the Deuteronomistic history and talk about the influence of the book of Deuteronomy on the books that come immediately after it. But when we look at Deuteronomy, and we've been studying it together this term, you can summarize some of the key themes of Deuteronomy around that whole issue of oneness. We talked about this and saw this theme explicitly when we looked at the Shema, the whole idea that, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God. Either the Lord is one or the Lord alone. And so Deuteronomy is adamant about Yahweh as being the one God of Israel, whether it's the Lord alone or the Lord's oneness. But that's a theme, and that transfers and connects with the rest of what's going on in Deuteronomy. So, for example, it's the book of Deuteronomy that centralizes worship. There's one place where you can worship the Lord, one altar where God is going to place the name Yahweh. That ultimately becomes Jerusalem, but at least in the book of Deuteronomy, it can be different places, as you'll see as you read through Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings before it becomes centralized in Jerusalem. There's also one standard, and that one standard in the book of Deuteronomy is what? It's the law of the Lord through Moses. That becomes a fundamental piece, and in some ways, through the rest of the scriptures, it's going to be the law of Moses, the Torah. The Lord's Torah is that one standard. And Deuteronomy has a certainty of justice. If we want things to go well, God's people were supposed to practice faithful obedience, and if they do, then they'll be protected and their life will be prosperous. If they deviate from the Torah, bad things happen. And then there's also the whole idea of devotion, the full response of God's people to God's faithfulness and God's salvation is devotion. And so we have that language, and we talked about that. Again, text in Deuteronomy, we see that in Deuteronomy chapter 6. You can see the cluster of language throughout that whole section, Deuteronomy 5 to 11, especially in chapter 10, verses 12 and 13. You get the words love, fear, cling, keep, walk, obey. All of that language of faithfulness is part of the theme that we have in Deuteronomy. Now, when we look at the prophetic books that are going to come, Deuteronomy's had a powerful influence on them. And the basis of the prophets is ultimately the Sinai covenant and God's relationship with Israel. And the prophets, and by the prophets I'm using the Jewish way of talking about the canon. So with the former prophets, beginning with Joshua, in the opening paragraphs of the book of Joshua, note that we have a reference that sounds that it's a reference essentially back to the Torah, especially using the language that we find in Deuteronomy to talk about the scriptures. So Joshua 1, 7 to 8, only be strong and very courageous, being careful to act in accordance with all the law that my servant Moses commanded you. That's Deuteronomy's language. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, so that you may be successful wherever you go. The book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth. You shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to act in accordance with all that is written in it. For then you shall make your way prosperous, and then you shall be successful. Now, the Psalms also begin with the same kind of verse, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. So notice that the rest of the Bible essentially emerges out of the Torah using the language that Deuteronomy establishes for the scriptures, that law of the Lord language. And so in a real sense, the remainder of the Old Testament, whether we call it Act 1 or the First Testament, it's commentary on Genesis through Deuteronomy. Now, why is it that we would call Joshua through 2 Kings prophets? It's because of all the prophetic activity that's in there. And so when you read through Joshua and 2 Kings, you notice the prophets are very active. When God's people are unfaithful, the Lord sends prophets. The prophets begin to appear in the book of Judges. And what some scholars noticed was that there's a consistent theological perspective in Joshua to the 2 Kings, and that consistent theological perspective is that of Deuteronomy. The first scholar to see this, his name was Martin Note, and he wrote a book, a very important book, right at the end of World War II, called the Deuteronomistic History. Actually, it was in German, had a longer German word. It was actually Studies in Deuteronomy. And what again, noted the prophetic activity, noted that there was a unified story that linked from Joshua through 2 Kings, and he noted that there was this consistent theological perspective that went back to the book of Deuteronomy. So Note observed that the whole idea of there being one God and the Lord alone, and he noted that Joshua through 2 Kings, as part of its central historiographic technique, reported all the deviations. So when you read Joshua through 2 Kings, you read some good news, but a lot of it is simply the narrator narrating all the times when Israel was unfaithful. We'll talk more about why that would be the case in a little bit. The one altar from Solomon onward, the judgment on all of the kings in Israel and Judah was simply, did they centralize and enforce centralized worship or not? And that key criteria essentially renders the entire northern kingdom, all of the Israelite kings, as evil because they followed in the way of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, whereas most of the southern kings were also either evil or less than very good, because they didn't centralize worship and they allowed worship out on the high places. Only Hezekiah and Josiah centralized the worship. There was one standard. All the kings get compared back with Moses and David. Did they have a heart like David? And notice that how the theological perspective of Deuteronomy even shapes the way that we talked about David. David was the person or a king after God's own heart. If we go back to the Shema, Deuteronomy chapter 6, we talked about what heart language means. It has to do with our intentions, our will, our minds with God. That's what set David apart from the other kings. So David and Moses became the standard. The certainty of justice. And when you read through Joshua through Kings, there was a consistent theological explanation for the problems that God's people faced. And so you can see that in places like Judges 2:6 to 3:6, where it explains this cyclical pattern of unfaithfulness, being oppressed by enemies, crying out to God, and then God delivering them as an explanation for trouble. Or 2 Kings 17, where there's an explanation for why the northern kingdom fell, which had everything to do with its unfaithfulness. And then there's the whole issue of devotion. And Joshua through 2 Kings used the language of motive. Again, a person after God's own heart. Wasn't fully devoted to God. And so Joshua through 2 Kings explores the motivations of key characters in the same way that Deuteronomy does. So Martin Note observed all of these things. Then what Martin Note also observed through Joshua through 2 Kings is that key characters in the narrative provided commentary at pivotal moments. And so Joshua 1, we have God specifically calling Joshua to faithfulness and to be a leader, that strong and courageous sermon. And so the Lord himself speaks at the beginning of the history. At the end of the book of Joshua, Joshua gives a speech to God's people and calls them to ongoing obedience at a key moment, because there's this pivot. At Joshua 1, the movement was from Moses to Joshua, so the Lord gives a speech to set the stage for the next section. Then to Joshua, Joshua is about to die, and he's dispersing the tribes into their land. That's what happens in the second half of Joshua, and now God's people prepare to go on without Joshua, and so Joshua gives a speech. In 1 Samuel 12, Samuel gives a speech at the end of the period of the judges to prepare God's people for what life is going to be like with a king. In 1 Kings 8, when worship is centralized in a temple, and Solomon builds his temple. Solomon gives a dedicatory speech to prepare God's people for that next phase in the nation's life. Now, when there isn't a key character to give a speech or an explanation, there's just sermons, and I mentioned these two earlier. Judges 2:6 to 3:6 explain why Israel failed in the settlement during the time of the judges, and 2 Kings 17 explains the collapse of the northern kingdom. Now, the key piece here is that all of these speeches and these explanations, when you study them, use vocabulary that's drawn from the vocabulary that Deuteronomy uses. So the influence of Deuteronomy shows up in these key themes that hold all the narratives together. Again, Martin Note doesn't argue that the same person who wrote Deuteronomy wrote all these other things, but what they're suggesting is that there was a Deuteronomistic historian who took the perspective of Deuteronomy and then gathered all of Israel's traditions and used the theology of Deuteronomy to weave a bigger story together into what we know as the former prophets. So it's a consistent story. And what Note suggested then is that these points of commonality, again, what are the points? The points of commonality were that Joshua through 2 Kings tells a unified story of Israel from coming into the land until exile. They have a consistent theology that's of Deuteronomy, and that these are stories about prophets. And then he observed that key characters and speeches that hold material together, that this sounds like Deuteronomy. And so for Note, what Note argues, and this is one of the interesting critical theories that argues for unity, is he suggests that all of this data pointed to a common author. And this gets called the Deuteronomistic history, and that the final author editor worked during the exile. And if you look at the last chapter of 2 Kings, it has a specific date, 37 years into the exile, so approximately 550. And so sometime after 550, an editor put together this Deuteronomistic history. And what Note suggested, well, it's interesting, Note wrote this book during World War II, and so that wasn't the most optimistic time. And so for Note, the whole point of the Deuteronomistic history was to give a theodicy, in other words, justify God's actions. Why was it that God's people were in exile? It wasn't that Yahweh failed, it was that God's people failed. And it gives an explanation for the collapse of the monarchy. In other words, Israel had it coming because of their unfaithfulness. Well, Note's theory in the broadest brushstrokes has endured. There's been, as you can imagine with scholarship, there's been lots of different caveats. People have found different redactional levels. Scholars have argued, and sometimes they try to argue against the theory, but Note's theory is really important. It's one of those key kind of fundamental critical theories that whether you agree with it or disagree with it, you have to engage it. And so you can read about it further. Simply Google Deuteronomistic history, or you can look for monographs on it. I can even encourage you to read Note's book. But it's an enduring theory that continues to carry weight. Now, after Note, his students have come along and said that Note was right about it being an explanation for the collapse of the monarchy, but it wasn't just a pessimistic theory. Gerhard von Rad, who was a contemporary of Note, was essentially persuaded by Note's presentation argument for unity, but actually argued that Joshua through 2 Kings was a book that had hope for restoration. And what Note looked to argue for hope was that von Rad observed, or what von Rad used to argue for hope, was that throughout Joshua through 2 Kings, as you would have prophets making predictions, and then later on down the road, there would be fulfillment. For example, you can open your scriptures to 1 Kings 13, where there's an unnamed prophet who makes a prophecy against Jeroboam, the son of Naboth's altars, his golden calf altars, and that ultimately gets fulfilled during the days of Josiah down in 1 Kings 22 or 2 Kings 22 and 23. And wherever there's a prophecy made, its fulfillment gets noted within these books. So Von Rad argues that what Deuteronomy, the Deuteronomistic history sets up is this theology of the power of God's word to shape the future. And Von Rad looks at the last paragraph of 2 Kings and notes that after all the years of exile, one of David's sons is still alive and has now been restored and is invited now to dine at the Babylonian king's table. And what Von Rad argues then is that that's a signal that God isn't finished with Israel yet and that there's hope for restoration, that the Messiah is going to come. Now, Von Rad's student, Hans Walter Wolff, and in some way Brueggemann picks this up, they argue that not only is there hope for restoration, but if you go back and read Joshua through 2 Kings, embedded within it is also an agenda for restoration. And that agenda for restoration is that language of return. So even when you go back and looking at the blessings and curses in Deuteronomy, it's almost as though they predict that something bad's going to happen, but there's a way back by turning back to the Lord. And when you read through Joshua through 2 Kings, you see periods in which God's people repent and God restores them. So embedded within this warning about the result of unfaithfulness is actually an agenda for what to do when you find yourself in a generation of unfaithfulness. It's a paradigm for returning to the Lord. And so Deuteronomy, significant. As you can see, Deuteronomy casts its influence and essentially links the original Tetrarch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, with the books that follow it, Joshua through 2 Kings. And so sometimes in the scholarly writing, you'll see that it's known as the primary history. So this is just a little taste. I wanted to talk at some point this semester about how Deuteronomy also serves essentially as the introduction to Joshua through 2 Kings and its influence. If we had more time, we could also talk about its influence on Jeremiah and even some of the Psalms. So hopefully this gives you a little taste of the importance of Deuteronomy and the rest of the Old Testament. If you have any questions, let me know and we'll talk about it.